him. Now, when I got to this point, I said, this all sounds real familiar. A week ago, David Lovin over at Crossway has a pastors' conference for small church pastors. And there are several of us in town, pastors that are involved, and oftentimes we're asked to speak. Dennis Walton and I spoke on Thursday. And I was asked to give a presentation. The theme of the conference was raising up the next generation. And the whole conference was themed around making disciples of this next generation as they come out. I was challenged in a lot of ways, and some of those ways I'm going to be sharing with some of the church. But I was asked to do a presentation on raising the next generation with regard to education, because DL knows that I'm real passionate about education. And in my study, I became convicted of some things that I feel like I've not done right, and some things. But anyway, this presentation is what I'm going to give to you this morning, because when I looked at this outline, I thought that's essentially, there is an idea, I think, that we are imbibing. Not just some of us, all of us. We're imbibing in this idea that I think is crippling Christianity. And we're going to talk about this morning. I have it under the title Christian Secularism. Now, you know what an oxymoron is. An oxymoron's two words that are opposites that you put together, like pretty ugly, right? Oh, I turned it off to cough, but I didn't turn it off. Pretty ugly is one. Blacklight is kind of one, right? Government intelligence, is that an oxymoron? I don't know. But Christian secularism is kind of my term. I don't know if anyone else has used this. I sort of needed something, a way to describe what I was thinking and what I was feeling when I'm thinking about the educational aspect primarily of raising the next generation. I see a problem, and I termed it under Christian secularism, the subtitle, Living in Two Worlds. It's hard to live in two worlds at the same time. All right, so next slide. We're going to jump in here. It's really small. We couldn't figure out how to make it bigger. I don't know if you can see that, but here it is. We do have a problem in the church in North America. The statistics, it's hard to say, doesn't change very much over the last 20 to 25 years. 70 to 75%, this is a later statistic, 70 to 75% of youth who are raised in church will leave the church somewhere between the ages of like 18 and 23. Now, this stat hasn't changed much in the last 25 years. It's anywhere usually between 60 to 80%. Now, sometimes we're tempted to say, at least 20 years ago or 15 years ago, the stats would suggest, the longitudinal studies would suggest, that after the age 23, half of those will come back and start attending church at least twice a month. And so sometimes we are encouraging ourselves with it's not really that bad. But beloved, here's my question. The kind of discipleship that I see in the New Testament is like, pick up your cross and follow me, right? No one can love father or mother more than me and be worthy of me. Even if you grant that 70% of our children leave the faith and come back, half of them come back after a few years, that seems like we're still doing something wrong to me. Does that make sense? It doesn't seem like the kind of discipleship I'm seeing in the New Testament. The second stat I have up here, this is just with teenagers in Gen Z. Gen Z is anyone born after 1999. This is not just Christians, but teenagers in Gen Z are twice as likely to identify as LGBT or as atheist. I'm going to go to the next one. I'll come back to that one. This is from September 2019, just a few weeks ago. 35 to 42 million youth. That's a big number. 35 to 42 million youth from Christian families are projected to leave Christianity by the year 2050. The article said it's the largest shift in religious affiliation in the history of this country. The Great Commission calls us to make disciples of all nations. And the reason I stuck that middle stat in there is because we should be reaching Gen Z if we're meeting the Great Commission. We should be making disciples of the next generation. But we're not. We're losing somewhere between 60, 70, 80% of our own children. Are you with me? We have a problem. Why are they leaving? Next slide. Why are they leaving? 2016 and 2018, Pew did a study. And in the 2016 study, students who had left the church were allowed to actually write in the reason. The top 5 or so is this: learning about evolution when I went away to college. That was a common theme. Religion is the opiate of the people. Does anyone recognize that? Religion is the opiate of the people. Where's that come from? Does anyone know? Karl Marx, that's right. The atheist, Karl Marx, that's his words. Rational thought makes religion go out the window. Lack of any sort of scientific or specific evidence of a creator. I just realized somewhere along the line that I didn't really believe it. Now, commenting on this study and the one in 2018, next slide, this gentleman, J. Warner Wallace, a Fox News contributor, he comments on it like this: the teaching that they question seems to be about the existence of God, and this is consistent with a variety of other recent studies. When Christians walk away from the faith, more often than not, it's due to some form of intellectual skepticism. Now, not always, but more often than not, it's to have to do with something that has to do with intellectual skepticism. Next slide. So, I think one of the problems contributing to this, not the only problem. Are you with me? Not the only problem. When someone talks about something and they start getting passionate, like I'm probably going to get, you can get the impression that they think that what they are saying is all that needs to be said about the issue. And I'm aware that there are other issues leading to this. You know, that old quote that I like: let me write the songs of a nation, I care not who writes its laws. I think that's true. I think media, has a big influence. I'm not talking about media this morning. I'm just talking about the formal education process of children. That's what we're talking, because that's what I was asked to address at the conference. So I'm going to talk about Christian secularism. And it's not the only problem, but I think it's a key problem. Now here's something I want to prepare you for. I hope this morning to be an equal opportunity offender. Because I don't think the problem is just with the way we educate or one institution. I don't even think the problem is only with Gen Z or Gen X or whatever's before them. I think we're 3 or 4 generations deep on this, and here's what I actually think. I think most of us in this room are Christian secularists. I might be surprised. I know that I was. I almost titled this message, Observations of a Recovering Christian Secularist, because I don't think I'm completely out of it. I think it's part of the air we breathe, and I think it's a blind spot that we have. So I'm hoping to offend all types of education, homeschoolers, Christian school. I'm going to try to throw them all under the bus. I'm going to try to throw the Sunday school teachers under the bus, and the parents and the pastors. I've got some things in my own heart that were a gut check 2 weeks ago when I was working on this, and I think that I've contributed to the problem by the way that I've pastored. Okay? So we're just going to have an honest gut check this morning, because I think we need to pay attention to this issue, because I think it is a key issue that's leading to the stats that we saw earlier. All right, next slide. All right. I went ahead and defined it for myself since it was my term. So here's my definition of what I mean by Christian secularism. We view some subjects, now primarily I was thinking of formal education, but it just goes with anything in life, right? We tend to think of some subjects as secular and therefore as religiously neutral. So mathematics is religiously neutral. There's nothing, that we tend to think of some subjects as secular and therefore religiously neutral, while some subjects we deem religious. And I think such thinking is not at all biblical. A Christian worldview is going to join all things with God. Now, we're going to get into that in just a minute. Next slide. Now, the reason is because of whose world it is. Whose world is it, class? God's. It is right. It's God's world. Someone was really good, whoever said that. So, there is nothing that I can find, no subject in education, no job that I go out and do. There's nothing that I can find in life where the stuff I'm working with doesn't have God's fingerprints on it. Peggy just told me a good joke about the devil. This was just this last week. It fits right good here, doesn't it? And I don't remember if I can remember it. But the devil and God were having an argument, and the devil told God, he said, I can make a human being. I figured out how to do this. And God said, well, let me see you. Just show me. And so the devil just scoops up a little dirt and starts piling it up. And God said, no, wait a minute. You get your own dirt. I made that dirt. Right? And even things that are wrong and that Satan uses still have God's fingerprints on them because God has created everything. It's His world. Are you with me? Now, let me just tell you something. When I preached this over at Westside, there was a half or a third of the amount of people here. And Casey can be my witness. They joined in. Boy, they're charismatic over there. So wake up and help me out here just a little bit. I need some support up here. Good gravy. Okay. It is God's world. So if I'm studying music, that's God's music. It's got His fingerprints on it. If I'm studying history, the book of Daniel tells me that God is orchestrating all of human history to give His Christ a kingdom. All of human history, according to the Bible, secular history too, all of human history is a saga about the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of darkness, battling it out. That is what the wars of the nations are about. And so every single subject and every single job, it all has the fingerprints of God on it. Right? It's God's world. Next slide. So we did this a couple of weeks ago because I was studying all of this for this, and I brought it into the sermon. The old theologians talked about the book of nature and the book of Scripture. What they said was, God reveals Himself to creation in two ways, in two books. The first is the book of Scripture. Actually, it's not the first. It's the first of importance. The book of Scripture, God's speaking to us in this book. But there's also the book of nature, right? God has spoken to us in everything that He has created. He's revealing Himself to us in everything that He's created. And so Romans 1:20 says, for God's invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. What's this saying? It's saying that the part of the purpose of music is to show me who God is and give me another reason to worship Him. Part of the purpose of art is to show us the beauty of our Creator and to give us another reason to worship Him. Part of the purpose of all of creation, not just an accidental property of creation, but the purpose of creation, is to give us all of these reasons to worship God. We learn about God through everything that we see and we study. It's all got His fingerprints on it, and it gives us more reasons to worship Him. So I'm going to be arguing it's impossible to study any subject without it leading you to God. Okay? Next slide, Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Everything in creation is telling us about God and giving us another reason to worship Him. Next slide. The old guys thought like this, and I mentioned this guy a couple of weeks ago, Johannes Kepler. There's these dates, 1571 to 1630. German astronomer and mathematician, key figure in the scientific revolution. This guy discovered the 3 laws of planetary motion. And he did it without a space shuttle, without a satellite, and without a calculator. Apparently, all he had is one of them little compasses, because that's what he's holding in his hand right there. His work helped lay the foundation for Newton's theory of universal gravitation. So this guy, you know, the scientists now are smart, and they're doing a lot of wonderful work, but the scientists of today are standing on the shoulders of giants. Do you understand this? Now, I don't know if you know this, but the scientific revolution of this age, it grew out of Christianity. Do you know that? Did you know the scientific revolution is a result of the Protestant Reformation? Do you realize that? What's the connection? As all of Europe got a Bible, and they all read things like Romans 1 and Psalm 19 and a lot of other texts, they said to themselves, wow, the Lord has created all of this to show us who He is, so it must be created in an orderly fashion, which means I should be able to study everything that I see in the world and come up with the laws that God has put in the world, because God is an orderly God. You see, it's Christian worldview that led to the scientific revolution. The atheistic or materialistic scientists of today are living on borrowed capital, and that is a fact. They're studying the creation as if it makes sense, while all the time writing books about how the creation's an accident. All this is accident. It doesn't make any sense. Did you catch that? How silly that is? They study it expecting that it does make sense, and that they're trying to find all these laws, while all the time writing books that say it's all an accident and it doesn't make any sense. It's self-contradictory, beloved. Here's what Johannes Kepler said about his own work. Next slide. I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him, since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature. They're priests. I wonder if scientists today think of themselves as priests, Jane. I wonder if they think of themselves as priests. I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him, since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature. It benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. So here's my next question. Is this how we think? Is this how we are training our children to approach all of life? Is this how we approach life? Do you think, well, I'm a carpenter, so therefore I have a secular job, and my job's not religious like the preachers? Did you know the word vocation? The word vocation is used a lot, and now it just means to be a welder or something. But the idea of a vocation also comes from the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant work ethic. And what they said, the word vocation comes from Latin, and it means calling. Did you know that? Are you with me? You guys are going to sleep, aren't you? You with me? It means a calling. And I can be called to be a truck driver, called by God to work in the world as a truck driver the same way that Jesus would be a truck driver if he were a truck driver. You see, do we think of the world like that? Or do we bifurcate the world into sacred and secular categories? Okay? Next slide. What's really going on is a battle of worldviews. Now, a worldview is a system of thought, a system, whole system. This is not just someone's view of the world. A worldview is a system of thought that explains reality. It tries to give an answer for reality. And there's a lot of worldviews, 5, 6, 8 worldviews. Pantheism, Christian theism, secularism, as we're going to see. There's a lot of different worldviews, okay? So it answers the big questions of life. Ravi Zacharias usually says 4 answers to 4 questions. Origin, where did I come from? Where did you come from? Meaning, does my life have meaning? Does your life have meaning? What about this frog? Does its life have meaning? Is there meaning in the universe? Morality. Who decides what's right and wrong? Do I decide for myself? Or is there a moral being at the head of this thing and he makes the rules? Or is there any right and wrong? Maybe there is no right and wrong. And destiny. Where am I going when I die? Where are you going when you die? Where's the frog going when he dies? Is the world going to anywhere? Is anyone guiding this thing? Or is it an accident, waiting to explode when it's hit by a big star? Am I going to destroy the world through pollution? Or is someone has his hand on this thing and guiding it? See, global warming is a worldview issue. It's not just a scientific issue. You see, gender, that's a worldview issue. Who I get to marry, whether or not I can take your seat and slap you or just shoot you. That's a worldview issue. It is. The next slide. So Christian theism, here's the way Christian theism answers these things. Origin, God created, now that's the worldview of the Bible, right? Are you with me? God created everything, and man is the crown of his creation. That's why you can eat burgers, but you can't eat people. Okay? It comes out of a Christian worldview. In India, a pantheistic world, you don't even eat burgers, right? Meaning, God's creation exists to bring glory and pleasure to God. I want you to stop and think about that for our relevance of our topic. If all of God's creation exists to bring him pleasure and to make him look good, should we acknowledge him when we're studying the world? Yes or no? Yes. You should, because the purpose of it is to make him look good. Morality, right and wrong, are defined by God's character and God's nature. So why is adultery wrong? Because God's a faithful God. Why is murder wrong? Because God has created all people in his own image, and therefore they have value, you see. Destiny, there's going to be a resurrection of the righteous to life, a resurrection of judgment for the wicked, and a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Someday this world's going to be burned up, and there's going to be a new one. That impacts how much I worry about global warming. Because, I'm serious, Genesis 9, part of the promise when Noah got off the boat, is that while the earth remains, cold and heat will not stop. Seed time and harvest will not cease. God's got his hand on it, and I'm not worried. But that's coming out of a worldview. Next slide. Secular humanism is an atheistic worldview, and here's what it gives the answers to these questions. Origin, we are all a product of an unguided, accidental process of Darwinian evolution. That's secular humanism. You're familiar with this. Meaning, there is no meaning in life. We are all accidents of a process that did not have us in mind. Morality, there is no God, so there are no morals. We make our own morality. It's just a figment of our imagination. Might makes right. If we can vote on it, it's right. You know, this worldview says that for years people thought homosexuality was wrong because they were lower down in the evolutionary process. But we are much smarter now, and we know that it's not wrong. That's the worldview. That's what they think. You are lower on the evolutionary ladder because you still are a bigot if you think it's wrong. Destiny, when you're dead, that's it. Nihilism, it's over. There's nothing more. That's a worldview. Impacts all kinds of things. Next slide. I mentioned this quote 2 weeks ago. I read it 2 weeks ago Wednesday. Scientists have faith too. Now don't read ahead of me, but listen to me. A lot of times we think that they've got it all figured out and we need to bow to their intelligent authority. But I just want you to know, materialism is a philosophy that says the only thing that's real are things that have a material cause. Sometimes it's called philosophical naturalism. Sometimes it's called materialism. It is a philosophy. It is unprovable. Listen, unprovable by science. But it is the worldview of most secular scientists today. Richard Lewontin, in the 90s, in a book review, makes this quote and this admission. And what he's going to admit is that the evidence does not point to materialism. We hold to materialism by faith. That's essentially what he's going to say. Here's the quote. Our, being the scientific community, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. You wanted to know what the key to understanding scientists was? Understand that they accept things that are against common sense. Okay? We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we have a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence. That means before the evidence. Okay? We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes, no matter how counterintuitive. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I don't know if you caught that. That's a pretty thick quote. What's he saying? The science doesn't prove or even point to a material cause for everything. We hold that by faith because we don't want there to be a God. That's what he's saying. It's the flip side of Romans 1. They suppress the truth in unrighteousness because they don't want there to be a God. You read some of the scientists who are at the top and actually honest, and you'll run into these things. They have faith too. Next slide. Beloved, there is no neutral ground. Either it's God's world or it's not. Jesus Christ, my Bible tells me, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, my Bible tells me that the reason scientific laws keep functioning, there's something to drop, this will work, the law of gravity, okay? Now, Hebrews 1 to 3 tells me that when I'm looking at this is the implications. When I'm looking at scientific laws, I'm just looking into the mind of God. What's it say? It says Jesus Christ upholds the universe by the word of his power. Are you embarrassed by that? Is that pre-scientific? Or do you believe that it really is Jesus' world? There is no neutral ground. There is nothing in this world that you can study that doesn't have God's fingerprints on it. Now, before I go on, here's what I want to do. Just so you don't get the wrong idea, let me brag a little bit on our public school and the administrators and the teachers, okay? Because I'm going to say some things that I don't want you to get the wrong idea on, right? We have one of the best, and I'm serious about this, one of the best public schools I think of anywhere. The more I talk to people, Andrew and I were just talking about this last week, the more I kind of look behind the screens, the more I see that we have Christians on the board, in the administration, and at the teacher level who are doing everything in their power to hold the line and even push the envelope, if you can say that in public. And I am very, very grateful. I was just talking to a buddy the other day who lives in St. Louis about education, and he said, you wouldn't believe the schools up here. It's not like back home, you know. So I understand that. And please, whatever I get ready to say, do not hear me throwing any teachers under the bus. Because my view, as you will see, is that teachers are missionaries. And I think I've said that before, and you've heard me. Missionaries. And I'm not going to throw a missionary under the bus. You understand that? Now, having said that, I'm homeschool, and I'm going to throw us under the bus. Rochester, throw you under the bus here in just a little bit, probably. And Christian schoolers. So this, to me, I just don't want you to misunderstand. To me, it's not an issue of just, well, this or this. And it's not that simple. The worldview tests that the Peers, P-E-E-R-S, gives to churches and schools shows that most Christian schools, they produce children that are just as secular as anywhere else. So this is not just a problem that is just fixed with a different educational system. This is a problem that runs so deep in our psyche that we all have problems. Are you with me? There is no neutral ground, and it's kind of a gut check for all of us that we need to be intentional. A simple flipping of a school switch isn't going to do the trick. More on that later. Okay, one more thing before we go. What I'm getting ready to do is give you some quotations. Now, the purpose of these quotations is so that you and I recognize there is a battle going on, number one. Number two, you need to realize that there are some people on the other side of this who understand what's at stake. I'm going to say it again. I'm giving these quotes so that to convince you there is a battle, and to convince you there are people on the other side who understand what the stakes are. And we need to be intentional. That's going to be the application. Next slide. Do you know how to kill God? Well, here's what Richard Bozarth, from the publication American Atheist in 1977, here's his advice. We must ask how we can kill the God of Christianity. We need only to ensure that our schools teach only secular knowledge. If we could achieve this, God would indeed be shortly due for a funeral service. All right, then in the next slide, don't change it yet. In the next slide, I'm going to quote someone, and here's what he's going to be saying. He was giving a speech in 1853, and what he's saying in this quotation, he's telling about a secret society that was formed in New York City in 1929, of which he was a part. Next slide, let's look at this quote. It's interesting. He's talking about this society. I went back and read the speech to make sure the quote was legitimate, okay? And he says this, the great object of this society was to get rid of Christianity and to convert our churches into halls of science. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to establish a system of state schools from which all religion was to be excluded, and to which all parents were to be compelled by law to send their children. And for this purpose, a secret society was formed, and the whole country was to be organized. And then speaking about 20 years later, he converted to Catholicism, repudiated his former beliefs, and was blowing the whistle 20 years later. That's the context. And he says this, later he says, the plan has been successfully pursued, and the views we put forth have gained great popularity, and the whole action of the whole country on the subject has taken the direction we sought to give it. Interesting. If you trace back, it was the Owenton Society is what it was called, Richard Owen, I think. And he says a lady named Frances Wright, she was a feminist and a public school activist in that day in New York. She's the one that invited him in. It's a very interesting address. Next slide. Horace Mann, in neighboring New Hampshire at the same time, here's a quote from him. What the church has been for medieval man, the public school must become for democratic and rational man. God would be replaced by the concept of the public good. I'm not trying to... What I'm trying to do here is to show that some of those stats that we saw, that we began with, I'm trying to suggest to you that maybe they're not accidental. You see, on this level where we are in Willow Springs, a lot of decisions are made for us already. There were things that were happening in the 1840s that are impacting our situation today that we have no control over. Are you with me? There are especially two, there's more than this, but two very important Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s that baked some of this in the pie for us. Are you with me? And there's only so much that we can do. I'm going to say this later, but I'm going to give you a hint. Most of the people in this community, there's no other option than the public school. Okay? No other option. And so my application isn't to discourage you from that, but to help you recognize what is going on a worldview level so that we can start thinking about ways to counteract a worldview issue. You can't fix a worldview issue with more pizza parties. It has to be dealt with on a different level, you see. All right, next slide. John Dewey, father of progressive education, a co-author of the first Humanist Manifesto. A humanist is a secular humanist. Back then, they considered it a new religion, and it's an atheist religion, right? So that's Dewey. Here's a quote: "There is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there is no need for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried." There's no truth. You hear that now. There is no room for fixed natural law or moral absolutes. There's Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist, has this great parable called the parable of the madman. You should look it up. It's really, really prophetic. And I'm not going to go through it because I'm going to be out of time if I do, but here's what basically, the point of the parable is that the atheists in the 1880s had killed God, but no one realized it yet. And the understanding of what had happened hadn't trickled down yet, but he said it will trickle down later. And we are living in a world right now where we are feeling the effects of the atheist killing God, so to speak, in the 1800s. All right? Next slide. I got to get moving. Professor of education and psychiatry at Harvard in 1984, Professor Chester Pierce said this: "Every child in America entering school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with certain allegiances toward our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, toward his parents, toward a belief in a supernatural being, toward the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity, and it is up to you teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international children of the future." Very interesting. So here's what I want you to see. On this level, and on this level, and on this level, I'm not projecting any conspiracy. But there are some people who understand what's going on, and it's purposeful. And we have to be careful not just to be pawns in a game. You remember how we said in the text, one of the things I saw was that it's a spiritual battle with demonic influences that are smarter and more powerful than we are? We need to recognize that there are bigger things going on sometimes than what we see with our eyes. Next slide. So what are we doing to combat the worldview issue that is at stake? We've seen that the Bible would recommend to us that in our study of all things, that God is through and through. I was looking just this week at the curriculum guide for School of the Ozarks, which is College of the Ozarks Christian Academy from K to 12. And I was looking through their curriculum guide, where it gives all its what do you call them? The targets, essentially. And in the math classes of the first 3 or 4 elementary classes that I looked at, the very first thing that students were to understand in math class was that God has given us math to help us. That's interesting, isn't it? I think what we've seen from the Bible, that there's a real importance that we connect the dots between God and everything that we're studying. We have seen that there are some atheists who understand that that's a big deal, and it's really important that we don't talk about God so that it can die. And beloved, those people were able to get it passed in the Supreme Court 40 years ago. If you don't realize that's what happened in the 60s. It took from the 1840s to the 1860s to get it passed. And the church is always behind, arguing about something down here that doesn't matter when the carpet's being ripped out from under us. And I'm trying to get us to see here's what's going on, you see. What do we do to combat this? Most parents, now here, let me say this. I'm not going to mention names, but I've got several families here that are, I'm going to even say it, working in the public school and have kids in the public school, and their kids are going to make it. You know why? Because they are being intentional. And that's my point. I would rather have an intentional parent send a child to public school than an unintentional homeschool. Not in this church, but I had a homeschool student walk up to me one time and tell me these words. He said, 2 times a week, I'm working in carpentry so I can learn something useful. Now, I didn't say this to him, but here's what I should have said. Congratulations, you're thinking like an atheist. Why is that? Because if you don't see the connection to all of these subjects and God, and you don't think that you're learning about God when you're learning about math, music, art, and science, you're an atheist. You're thinking like one. Actually, he was thinking just like John Dewey, because that's where the pragmatism was born. So here's a Christian homeschooler who thinks like an atheist. It's a lot better to be an intentional parent sending them to public school than to develop something like that. So this is not just about what school we go to. It's about intentionality. How are we going to battle this? Going with the flow? Is that enough? Next slide. I'm sorry, we're going to be a little late, but this is almost wrapping up to a close. Is it enough? Charles F. Potter in 1930 said this: education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism. And every American school is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday schools meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of the 5-day program of humanistic teaching? Beloved, that is exactly right. The reason I'm giving this address is because in my heart there is something that has happened over the years. When I was milking cows at College of the Ozarks, I was called to 2 things. I was called to teach the Bible, and I was called to go back. I remember saying this in my dorm room. I wanted to go back to a church like the one that I grew up in and give children what I never got until I entered the religion department, the philosophy department. And so the Lord miraculously stuck me in the church that I was baptized in. And I've preached almost 12 years. There's been a lot of good things happen. But I am discouraged because I'm watching baptism, excited about Jesus, less so. And then once you get up to a certain age, I can tell we've lost these 5 and these 3 are going to be okay. I don't know the math. I'm just seeing it. And what we're doing isn't enough. I was convicted over this last couple of weeks working on this. The way that I've pastored and taught has contributed to this problem in this way. Here's the way. Because I've been so biblical, and it's good, I love the Bible, and it's good to teach the Bible, right? I'm not in the real world. I'm in Christian, all kids are in Christian education. It's just a different universe that I'm in. And I forget what people have to deal with in the real world. You know what I ought to be doing? All I'm doing is teaching from the Bible. But you know what I ought to do? I ought to have regular classes in which we are connecting the dots between all of these subjects and God. I ought to be getting with our children's department and saying, how are we going to connect some of these dots and fight against this thing that I know about? Where have I been? So that's me. Next slide. So solutions. When I was building this for the pastor's conference, my wife says, you have to say something positive. And I said, I don't know what the answer is. She says, you can't leave it like that. So I thought of some things to say, but I don't know what the solutions are. All right, here's some that I wrote down. We need to recognize the deeper problem. When I was up at the school several years ago, I'd been called up there to counsel after a suicide. They thought it was a suicide, and I never heard officially, okay? And me and David Lovin and Scott Williamson was standing by Derek Hutzel after we walked outside after we had been comforting everyone. And Hutzel was telling us, as pastors, you guys, pastors and churches, you need to do something. This is way too Even if it happens occasionally, it's way too common, and you need to do something. And we started talking about things that we could do. But I didn't say, which was rare, I didn't say very much in the conversation because there was a voice in the back of my mind saying, it's not going to work. You're peeing in the wind. Because it's the atheism that's built into the curriculum that is part of the problem. And you've got to fix the atheism and the nihilism before you can fix the shooting yourself because your girlfriend dumped you. I preached a sermon of a little boy who killed himself. Right here, now he didn't kill himself here, but that's where I preached the sermon, because he was having a bad day and his girlfriend dumped him. There is a deeper problem that has to be fixed on a deeper level, and we have the answer. And some of you are missionaries on the front lines, and you need to be aware, and the church needs to be doing more to equip you. Secondly, that's several points down. Second, go ahead. All of us need to understand a Christian worldview. We need to be able to connect the dots between math and God. And if you don't see any connection, you don't yet have a Christian worldview. I always use math because I hate math, and because if there's one subject that seems totally godless, and I mean like there's nothing religious about this, it would be math in my book. What? You like math. And Algebra 1 was the toughest 3 years of my life, and that is true. Every time I moved up, Mrs. Ryburn moved up, and every time I flunked, she stayed where she was teaching. I had her 5 years in a row. I love her, but it was terrible for both of us. Next slide. We must help children connect the dots between all subjects and God. We've got to start doing this. Got to start doing that. I was going to tell another story, but we've got to move on. Next slide. Teachers in the public school system, I beg of you, think of yourselves like missionaries in a closed country. Please. I think this is just me, and I may be wrong. I'm anxious for the teachers to come up afterwards and tell me whether they think this is right or not. But I think a teacher needs three things to be happy. You need a sense of mission. I'm doing something of value, changing the world here. You need to feel supported by the administration and the people up above you, because the parents aren't going to. Am I right? And you need to, when you look at your check, you need to feel valued. I'm serious. Why do we, it's in a world where a bunch of grown men who put on tight pants and fight over a piece of leather, they are rich and we don't pay teachers, that's a society that deserves what it gets. That ticks me off. So, but teachers, I've said a lot of discouraging things about the mission, but I know it's not your fault, and you know that too, and you need to think of yourselves like missionaries think of themselves. What did Jesus say? You be as innocent as doves, but as shrewd as serpents. Which is why I think we need to pump in as many Christians into the public school as possible as teachers and administrators. And, next slide, I think we need to take seriously a growing need for real Christian education. I don't mean the kind of bland Christian education that's so common that treats education like secular school with a Bible study. And all they do is, it's worse than going to public school because they don't have the resources to give the good education to begin with. All they do is give a bad worldview and a bad education. It's irritating. Real Christian education that connects the dots for students, we have very few options around here. And very few people that will support such options because this is bear country. And believe it, we need to start thinking about the kingdom and start recognizing we need to pump in Christian teachers and administrators and find ways of educating children in a Christian worldview so we can see that number going down. At the risk of looking like we're patting some of ourselves on the back or something, I was looking at the promotional literature for classical conversations. It's a homeschool co-op program that we started doing because we couldn't afford to send them to OCA anymore. It's just too expensive. So we started doing the homeschool thing again, as bad as we hate it. And I was looking at the classical conversations curriculum guide, or their little magazine, and in their promotional literature, they had these three balloons of statistics. One was how many of their graduates 5 years later are still involved in church. One was how many got their top pick of college, and one was how many did something on SAT or whatever. And the one that I was doing this lecture as I was looking at that, and it said 97% of our graduates are faithfully attending church after graduation. And I had just written this statistic down. 30% of the other, and it's apples and oranges, I know, so you have to be careful. But I think we need to be instructing children in a worldview throughout all of it, because I think that's a serious need. That's a kingdom of God issue. See what happens there. Second, or last, equip parents to instill a Christian worldview. The fact remains that we have very few options, and this is where we are, and we have a really good situation here because we have a good school. But it's not enough. Parents, grandparents, going with the flow is not working. In this church, it's not working. Okay? I was going to say something, I'm not going to, but let me say it this way. I've just seen too many people in this church walk away from the faith. And I don't feel like there's a lot that I could have done to stop it. And I'm watching parents that are making it work because they're working at it. So we need to equip the parents. I don't know how yet, but we need to figure out a way of doing this. All right, next slide. I'm going to end with a quotation to get you battle ready, to send you out the door, okay? This is from John Dumphy. The last line for where it comes from is cut out. I don't even remember what year it was. In the 70s, I think, if I remember right, or maybe 80s. He says this: I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or a large state university. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity and the new faith of humanism. Did you know that when the Humanist Society started, and John Dewey helped write the Humanist Manifesto, and he and many others, I think Horace Mann too, but I'm not sure, signed it. They wanted to be considered a religion for tax-exempt purposes. And they were able to do that, as far as the laws in the Supreme Court was concerned, if I'm not mistaken that. But they also wanted to be in the schools as a religion. But the way to get religion out of the schools was to say, we don't need the sectarian religion in the schools. So, for all intents and purposes in our society, it's not called a religion anymore because it's in the schools. You can't teach religion in the schools. But I just want you to know, historically, there was a contradiction there. They wanted to be a religion for the free exercise clause, and not a religion because of the establishment clause. Don't be duped. It's either God's world or it's not. There is no neutral ground. And let's not give ground so willingly, All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pray. We're just going to walk out way past time. And beloved, I hope that this was received in the spirit that it was given, because I've been setting on some of this for an awful long time because I didn't know how to approach it because I didn't want to discourage anyone too much. But it's time that we start having a gut check and an honest conversation, I think. All right, I have some things I'm going to change because of it, and maybe you will as well. Our Father, we are grateful. We ask that you would help us to preserve our children and to raise them up in the fear and the admonition of the Lord.